Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for another episode here at the Amazing Podcast. We talk a lot about cloud native, we talk a lot about DevOps, and recently we've been also bringing in some more variety into our podcast. So the last episode we spoke about databases, particularly vector databases. So we're also kind of doing a bit more variety apart from the usual cloud native and Kubernetes. And I'm Twain Taylor, editor at amazic.com, and we do some pretty cool stuff talking about all of the innovative ideas that things that are happening in the space. So if you like what you hear today, go and check us out at amazic.com. We've got articles, lots more interviews, we've got event coverage, the KubeCon and all of that. So go and see what's happening there. Today as well, I'm really excited because we are kind of going off on a tangent from our Kubernetes conversations to talk a bit more about, we're going to talk about, just authorization and what that means and access control. And we're going to be talking with Omri Gazitt, who is the co-founder and CEO of Aserto. So Omri, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, Omri. So if you can get us started just telling us a bit about yourself, your background, and what you've done before co-founding Aserto, that would be a great start.
Yeah, sure. I started my career as an engineer back in the early 90s, and I was lucky enough to join a startup almost right out of school. I was the first founding engineer of the team, and about 7 years later, we went public. So I call that my rose-colored tour through startupdom. But I learned a ton about, how software is built in kind of the early stages of the journey. And, that was a lot of fun. The second stage of my career was at Microsoft, where I spent almost 14 years. And I was, again, lucky enough to join right at the time that we were starting .NET. I was one of the co-founders of that project. And
really cool.
The general manager for the app server division, and later on helped start Azure as well. And specifically, one of the services that my teams were working on was the Azure Access Control Service, which became Azure Active Directory. And so, that's where a lot of my passion and my interest in identity and access came from. And then the third stage of my career was really about, after leaving Microsoft, I really wanted to immerse myself in open source and ended up working on OpenStack and Cloud Foundry, and later on Docker and Kubernetes while I was at HP, the VP and the leader for the cloud division there. And then went to Puppet, also worked on open source. And of course, Aserto is also an open source company. So that I would say is the third chapter.
A lot of credentials there. I'm really excited for that chat. I'm sure you're going to bring in a lot of perspective here. So to get us started about our topic for today, the most basic question I've written about this multiple times, but, I still need to really get clarity on this, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners as well. Just the difference between authorization and authentication. What's the difference between the two? What are they?
I think it's a great question. And to be honest, even people who've been in security don't often, kind of have a great explanation for this. But the simplest one is, authentication is about proving that you are who you say you are. So back in the old days, and when we logged into operating systems, it was a user ID and a password. And of course, today we have biometrics or passwordless or magic links or all sorts of like 2FA and things like that. But ultimately, it's the same function, right? It's proving you are who you say you are. Whereas authorization is about kind of determining what you can do in the context of a particular application. And so these things work hand in hand. And so you have to have authentication first. Otherwise, without a user context, what is there to authorize, right? You have to know who it is that you're trying to do the action. But authorization is very much a distinct operation from authentication. And a lot of times people forget that. And when they treat their authentication systems as authorization systems, then they get in trouble.
Yeah, and I think also because a lot of the products, the solutions in the space kind of put the two together and offer them probably together, and so there's some overlap as well, and how is it for you with starting Aserto? Were you very clear that you want to be focused on authorization and not get into authentication as well? Could you kind of tell us a bit about that decision? Was it a very clear-cut decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was working in the early days of Azure, it was pretty clear the operating system basically did everything, right? So it logged you in, so it did authentication, and it also verified that you had permissions, like typically that would be on files or inodes in the Unix case, to whether you had read, write, or execute permissions on certain things. And of course, the kind of the application packages, the SAPs and the Oracle PeopleSofts and all those things, they had RBAC. They had roles that were implemented as groups in Active Directory or in LDAP. And so authorization was, again, a function that was done by the operating system. It was clunky, but it worked. An admin had one place that they went to in order to configure which users belong to which groups, and those groups typically would map onto some capability in that software. And when we first started working on, the question we all had was, we know software is moving to the cloud, right? We have Salesforce, we have ServiceNow, we have Workday, we have all these things that are building up. And they have to go build their own authentication and their own authorization. And the first thing as an industry that we set out to do was fix the authentication problem. Because, in the days of operating systems, you had single sign-on, basically, right? Of course, when software moved to the SaaS model, everybody had their own user ID and password, which was a nightmare. So the first thing we had to do as an industry was move to fix single sign-on for the web. And so we invented things like OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect and SAML and JWT and all those things. And now we have an interoperable identity fabric. No one has to go build login if you don't want to, right? But authorization hasn't moved forward at all. And so when we first started Aserto and tried to look at what was still hard to do, we said, authentication is mostly a solved problem. Authorization, far from it. There's a huge vacuum, huge gap. And that's why we wanted to go focus on that, and basically understand that we wanted to work hand in hand with the people who already fixed the authentication problem. So we want to, be the chocolate to Auth0's peanut butter or Okta or Azure Active Directory. All those people that do authentication well, we don't want to compete with them. We want to complement them.
All right. Really cool explanation. And, just as you said, it was simpler back in the day when it was all just username and password based, single sign-on. Things have gotten more complex, in the recent years, especially with containers and Kubernetes, cloud native. The stack has just gotten a lot more, chopped up into different pieces. And so considering this, how would you trace the evolution or, how is it even for an organization when they talk about authorization for a startup versus an enterprise? How do you see some of the growing pains as an organization grows when they're dealing with authorization? What are some of the challenges that come up along the way? And how do organizations try to meet these challenges? What are some anti-patterns that you see? Anything on kind of the evolution of authorization in an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think even when you're a startup, back in the day, you used to build monoliths and you had one place, that you had to go kind of set up the mapping between users and groups or roles. And then you had, kind of a single code base where you had to sprinkle a bunch of kind of imperative logic to figure out whether does this user have this particular permission to perform this operation. It's only gotten worse with the move to microservices. So, as a startup, Aserto has like at least a dozen microservices that we run. And unless we actually think about it holistically, we run into a bunch of hot water, right? So we actually use our product to authorize our product, and it helps us quite a bit. But as you can imagine, when you move from a startup, maybe a tech-focused startup that's building a SaaS, to being a larger company, it's not just multiple microservices. It's you have a bunch of different applications. Applications that you've built in-house, obviously some applications that you buy from other places. And the notion of managing the entitlements of users to permissions, it's an n times n problem. It's a cross product because every application exposes permissions and roles in a different way. And so admins live in this nightmare where they have to manage the cross product of users and applications. And that's not a sustainable place. And so our strong belief is that we as an industry have to move forward from this, right? In the same way that we had to solve single sign-on for SaaS applications, we have to solve the authorization for multiple applications in an enterprise. This has to happen.
Mm-hmm. And I want to also dig in a bit more into this and ask about kind of what's at stake, for organizations that, get it wrong or don't follow best practices, don't have the kind of setup that they need for authorization. What's at stake when authorization goes wrong?
So, one thing is if you talk to security teams, they'll tell you that broken access control is a huge pain in their, in their side, so to speak. And the reason, we also look at the OWASP top 10, we follow that. And broken access control moved from, I think, number 5 or number 6 to number 1 over the last couple of years. And so this is a problem that's getting worse, not better. And broken access control, for those who don't know, is, basically anything that has to do with a user having some permissions to resources that they shouldn't. And so if you're building authorization the wrong way, you definitely have that risk. I already talked about the nightmare of admins managing these permissions. It turns out that misconfigurations are rampant. Over-provisioning is the norm. And so like all of these zero trust principles that we hear about, like principle of least privilege, unless your authorization system allows you to practice them, they're just words, right? So, you really need a fine-grained authorization system if you want to follow the principle of least privilege, as an example. So the costs are enormous, both in terms of, risk to the business, as well as, problems with real breaches and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I kind of get what you're talking about. And as you're saying that as well, I'm thinking about even the other side of the problem, which is if you, you're talking about one, escalated privileges and giving users too much privilege. But on the other side, could privileges be even too restrictive in some cases, and could that really restrict innovation and kind of the pace of operations? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. If you get it, if your enterprise is so afraid because perhaps it was breached and because you had to go put in draconian measures, you're just slowing down your pace of innovation and you're not going to be able to keep up. So, having a solution to this problem is critical because it allows you to continue to maintain the agility that you need and give your employees the permissions they need, but no more than that. So that if, in the case of a compromised identity, and we all know it's a matter of when, it's not if, in today's world, breaches happen, but you want to limit the blast radius of that breach. And one of the most, kind of proven techniques of doing that is, kind of assigning just enough permissions to a user, but not more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to get into a bit in the next question about just the solution to this, but I want to also ask you before that, what some of the exciting developments in this space that you've seen in the recent years in terms of, generic solution, like, I see there's a stand-up behind you talking about policy as code and RBAC, ABAC, all of these things real time. and I kind of got those as well on my mind. But which is something that you feel excited about when you think of the space in the past few years? What do you think is one of the most exciting developments that you see?
I think there are two things that are starting to coalesce some ecosystems around them. One is the Open Policy Agent project out of the CNCF. Basically, the ideas of attribute-based access control are not new. They were pioneered in kind of like the probably the early 2000s is when a lot of the specs like XACML were written and things like that. I'm old enough to remember that. But I would say OPA is the first developer-friendly packaging of some of those ideas, and it facilitates this idea of policy as code. And one of the nice things about policy as code is it allows for separation of duties. So once a developer writes the authorization policy, and they can actually put it in a different source control system and like hand the keys to the security team. And security team can basically own the evolution, the life cycle of that security policy. And every change to that security policy is audited. And so you can basically facilitate a natural workflow between the application teams that no longer have to deal with authorization in their code and the security teams that basically own that. So I think OPA is a meaningful step forward in that direction. The other thing that I think is very exciting is the relationship-based access control, or RBAC model, that was popularized by the Google Zanzibar paper. Zanzibar is Google's internal system for how they do authorization for Google Docs and Google Drive and Calendar and Google Cloud and a number of other internal properties. Now, they didn't open source anything. They didn't even write a spec. What they wrote was a technical report. But that has influenced and inspired a set of vendors to try to go build open source implementations. And among them, Aserto, we looked at that model and we said, wow, this is a cool model. This is a very opinionated model, right? So it says, basically authorization is expressed as these tuples, as these relationships between object and subject. So we could say, that Twain is a reader on this document, or we could say that Twain is a member of the viewers group, and the viewers group has read access to this folder, and this document happens to be in this folder. And authorization is just walking that graph of relationships and finding out whether Twain has the read permission on this document by virtue of these connections. And that's it's an opinionated model, but it's a very exciting model because a surprising number of scenarios can be expressed in those terms. Now, you still need some attribute-based, facilities there. For example, attributes on users or attributes on these resources. And so a combination of these two approaches is really exciting, and that's exactly what we've built with our open source project, Topz. So Topz takes the best of OPA and Zanzibar and kind of brings them together into a single open source project and a single Docker container that you can run, and it'll do everything for you. RBAC, ABAC, RBAC, the best of OPA and Zanzibar.
Okay, really cool. Wow, that's a lot of background you packed in there. I definitely want to go check out that report on Zanzibar. And really exciting, the things that you mentioned. I love how you tied the different threads talking about, policy as code and ABAC and how they come together and how you need both. And even some great examples there. So yeah, wonderful response. I'm really enjoying just how you break these things down in a really easy to understand and in an interesting way as well. Topz, so sounds interesting. So how did Topz start? How did the idea come up? And was it, how long ago was it? How long after that did Aserto start? Could you give us some of the origin story of Topz?
Yeah, so when we started Aserto, it was our intention from the beginning to open source our authorizer, because that's the engine, and developers want to feel like they understand, that piece of it, and they can potentially, add to it, contribute to it if they need to, and ultimately, in the developer community these days, the engine that you bet on, you want to be open source because you want to basically limit your risk that the vendor that you're working with is going to do something squirrely to you and things like that. So that's a very tried and true pattern these days in software that is developer focused. And that's definitely our audience. Our audience is developers. Now, we basically spent a little bit of time understanding the problem space. And we started with a very OPA-centric view because that was the only thing that was around. And as we started looking at other problems, working with customers, understanding their domain, we started mapping more and more of their internal use cases to a relationship-based model. And so we felt that that was going to be a very important part of the value proposition. And so we built, kind of our open source project, not because the world needs yet another, open source project, more because we saw this huge hole. Like OPA doesn't have a data story. It doesn't have a data plane. It has a great story for policies, but not for data. And so we felt like the best way to express that data that you need for authorization, user data, resource data, and the relationships between them is that Zanzibar model, the reback model. And so we shipped, an open source authorizer late last year that addressed that need, and we saw some really good uptick. We saw a few hundred people come in and started, and almost immediately, and we started seeing a lot more interest in what we were doing commercially as well. So Topaz is a great way for people to get started with Aserto. You don't need anything for it besides just Docker on your machine, Docker pull it, and you can run it. You can get started, in 5 minutes, or your next one's free, so to speak. But if you want a management experience over it, if you want a control plane that allows you to manage all of the policies and the data centrally and the decision logs centrally, then that's where Aserto comes in, and we have a commercial solution for that.
All right, really neat. So how old is it? Is the project now? When did you guys start?
So we started the company about 2 years ago, and Topaz, the authorizer we've been working on and has been available to, kind of Docker pull for a while. We open sourced it back in late October of last year. So it's been 6 months.
Okay, all right. Wow, pretty cool. Early days. That's nice.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so so Aserto, one of the things that I saw on the Aserto website is this claim that you can enforce in milliseconds, enforce policies, I'm guessing. And that's quite amazing in milliseconds. And obviously, this is going to be all automated and systematized. But if you could kind of give us an overview of how this actually works, because it does sound, quite amazing that you can actually enforce policies, make changes at millisecond speed, pretty much in real time, as you have in the banner behind you. But yeah, if you could just tell us some more and explain how this works, that would be great.
Yeah, let me kind of first explain kind of why the architecture of authorization is so important. So if you think about developer services like Stripe or Twilio or SendGrid, that can be some service that I talk to over a REST API, and I'm going to, it's very important that it work, right? But it's not in the critical path of the application. That is, as long as I queue up a payment, and I have a high degree of, kind of certainty that it's going to go through, I don't need to stop the user doing what they're doing. Likewise, sending a text message and things like that. These are not in the critical path. Whereas authorization is in the critical path of every application request. We find that our customers often do at least one and often more than one authorization call, for every user interaction in their front end. And so that means that the authorizer has to be local to the back end of the application. Otherwise, if you're taking 100 millisecond network round trip for every authorization decision that your application needs to make because you're talking to a hosted authorizer, that's just not fast enough, right? And so from the beginning, we realized that the authorization had to be local, and it had to be a sidecar or a local microservice that's running in your cloud as a customer, right? But we also felt like having a control plane that manages everything is why people pay for developer services. They don't want to stand up everything on their own. And so having that hybrid architecture was really, really important. back to milliseconds, and which was your question, because you're running the authorizer locally, it's basically, and it has all of the data that it needs to make a decision cached locally. It's basically just making, local calls. So as, just kind of taking you through what an authorization call is, you're basically calling our authorizer over gRPC or REST. It will look up the user in its own embedded database based on a key. That's a constant time operation. It already has the policy loaded up, and it'll basically load up the resource and evaluate relationships by walking, that graph like we talked about. Those are very, kind of fast operations that can be, fulfilled very quickly. And so that's why local authorization happens very quickly, because it happens over cached data. Now, the other question, the most obvious question then is, well, wait a minute. I want, authorization that happens in terms of the real-time information about our users. And that's where our distributed systems architecture comes in, right? So anytime a user attribute changes in our control plane, we send that over a high-speed data fabric to all the authorizers that are connected to the control plane. And so they have the latest policy, they have the latest data. And so when it comes time to make an authorization decision, they can basically make it locally, right? So you have the best of both worlds. You have essentially near real-time data, that you're making authorization decisions on, but the data is cached. So you don't have to go somewhere to retrieve it to make that authorization decision. That's what we think is unique about our approach.
Neat. When you talk about cache, though, one of the things that could happen is cache could even kind of slow things down. Where is this cache? Where does it sit? And could you tell us a bit more about that? How you manage the data and cache and making sure it doesn't affect even the performance or the speed.
Yeah. So basically, Aserto, the Topz authorizer is a single container image, right? So you Docker pull it, you run it, and that has an embedded database in it. And that's what I mean when I say cache. That's where all the data is stored. So the first thing that it does is, if you connect it to the control plane, it downloads all of the data, from the directory, and then it establishes a high watermark, right? So any, kind of additional changes or delta diff down to any of the authorizers that are listening, the Topz authorizers. And so the data lives in an embedded database called VoltDB. And so, it's an index database. And so lookups are very quick. And so that's why when I say cache data, I mean, it's a copy of the, kind of authoritative data, so to speak, right? So it may be, kind of a second or two out of date at times, but it's much, much better than, kind of like the state of the art today, which is today, a lot of the times, either you're making a call to a policy information point that takes, many, hundreds of milliseconds or even seconds to go bring down, or you do like a data dump, out of your identity provider once a day, right? So those are the types of latencies that we're talking about. Whereas, with Aserto, with our architecture, your data is, essentially near real time, and the authorization calls are lightning fast.
Really cool. I was wondering if you could give us a glimpse of kind of Aserto, the product or the dashboard, how it works, some sort of a demo or even an architecture diagram, if you have something of that sort to share.
Oh yeah. So let's see. I did not prepare it, but I can certainly show a quick architecture diagram and maybe even, let's see, share the screen. Great. So, here we have kind of the Aserto architecture that I talked about, which is authorizing locally, but managing centrally. The local authorizer has all the data that it needs to make a decision, because it has the policies and all the data, kind of cached in its edge directory. The decision engine is the OPA engine that we use as a library, and the decision logs are collected locally and then pushed up to the central control plane. And the control plane basically mediates between the outside world. So users, for example, the source of truth for users is an identity provider like Azure Active Directory or Auth0. The policies are all stored in version in a GitHub Git like source control system, a policy is built into an image, like a Docker image. So it's stored in the Docker Hub or in GitHub Container Registry or GCR or whatever it is. And then decision logs are poured out into your SIEM system. So whether it's Splunk or Elk or something like that. And the console is, we basically have a set of policies. I can go look at, set of policies that I'm running. We have very fast, kind of like quick starts for, how to integrate Aserto into your application. We have a simulation. We have an environment where you can look at all the different Rego files for your policy that's loaded. Each one of these is running, kind of a running instance in our hosted authorizer. So, for example, I can simulate what a user, whether a user has access to a particular resource here. I can simulate all of the resources at the same time, a call that we call decision tree, that basically shows me all the permissions for all the users. Everything is captured, and it's a decision log. So everything we do here is, captured. And of course, then, we have the full directory. So all the users that we imported come from an identity provider and show up here. So for example, I can look at Karen, and Karen has a set of incoming relations. For example, she may be a member of certain groups. So for example, Karen is a member of a viewer group, and the viewer group has a set of members. So these relationships are bidirectional. So basically, every one of these things I can navigate. Karen may have a manager. So I can basically reason about all of these properties in a policy that says, hey, allow Karen's manager, Syed, to do, to have certain, capabilities. But, like if Syed is trying to do something for somebody that doesn't report to them, then that should be, an access denied, so to speak. So all these relationships are fully navigatable and modelable in our system. And it's all very, kind of like it's very extensible. So we have a set of built-in object types like users and groups, but you can add your own, like you can add organizations. Each one of these organizations has its own, instance and its own relations. So for example, this particular organization is owned by UN. It has a set of viewers and members. So you can model your own domain in Aserto, and that allows you to create very fine-grained and very domain-specific policies.
Wow, pretty cool. So if someone is not familiar with Rego script, for them as well, I think this really simplifies the workflow, right? Because I see that a lot of it is UI based.
Exactly. So everything, you start with code. We believe that developers like to work in code, but ultimately, if you want, a management environment for everything, that has to do with your authorization policy, you do want, an admin console. And so, of course, we have APIs for everything and, CLIs for everything. So developers can work in the mediums that they like. But ultimately, if an admin is going to need to like manage some of these policies, you want some training wheels for them as well.
Wow, really cool. Yeah, thanks. That was a really cool demo and looks like really powerful product. But I like how it's just organized in a really systematic way. It doesn't look daunting at all. It's very clear, the different roles and how you can edit them easily. So it's really cool. And I guess even setting up policies is pretty simple, right? You were mentioning that there's some ready-made, I think, templates available that you can pretty much edit and get started with. Could you tell us a bit about that, the getting started experience?
Yeah, so basically, we have a set of policy templates. We provision one for you. And, in fact, we even have a little bit of a getting started experience inside of the product. I can pull that up here as well for you. Let me share again. Basically, whenever you show up, whenever you sign up for an account in Aserto, you'll have a set of steps. You can download, basically a sample app in whatever language you want. We just added Java as well. So you can basically have source code, fully working source code that works against an authorizer instance that we've provisioned for you. We can basically have a little bit of a tutorial in terms of how the policy works. And, so take you through all of that and, then kind of show you how to do a policy as code workflow and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of internal UI for helping you get started and get productive within the system.
Awesome. Wow. Really cool. And I want to also ask about governance and compliance, because that's very closely related as well to authorization. So how does Aserto help with, simplifying governance and compliance? How does Aserto help with that stuff, the policies and decision logs and all of that?
Exactly. I mean, those are exactly those two things. So the first thing that you want is you want to take authorization out of the program, out of the application, and extract it out and store and version it separately. And I think just doing that, and I think if you talk to any authorization vendor, they'll say the same thing. We all believe in that. We all believe in, like it's time for authorization to not be spaghetti code all over your application. It's time to kind of pull it out, centralize it, and manage it. And that, kind of increases governance and compliance just by itself, because, if you put that, kind of authorization policy under the auspices of, the team that's authorized to make changes to it, you have a complete audit trail of every change that you made to the policy by virtue of a Git log, which is by itself amazing, right? I mean, this is why we do configuration as code. Back when I was a Puppet, we talked about configuration as code, infrastructure as code. Now we really think about policy as code, right? That's one thing. The other thing that's super important is, as you said, decision logs. So, today the, more or less the state of the art is that every authentication provider will give you a log of when, Twain logged into this particular application, right? But that doesn't tell you anything. It tells you just when you logged in. It doesn't tell you what Twain actually did. Whereas with fine-grained decision logs, every decision that the application made is logged and then centralized to a central store. And then you can pour that into your, ELK system to do analysis. And that's where the compliance team really, kind of enjoys the benefits of having kind of a single view of everything that the user has ever done in that application. And they can run all sorts of things, like they can do anomaly detection to figure out, oh, Twain logged into Salesforce, but he's not in the sales group. So what's up with that? Let's go figure out how he got that particular permission, and maybe, kind of figure out why and turn it off if it's not really needed anymore, right? So that, kind of having the data is the first step towards being able to build a, proactive compliance program.
All right. We're winding down. Last few questions here. But, for someone listening to this, and after thinking, I kind of get it. We definitely need better authorization, and seems like, this approach would really work. And I need to check out Aserto. With you talking to different people, different organizations, what according to you are some of the big obstacles that organizations face when they want to change or, move to a better authorization platform? What are some of the obstacles that they face, and how can they deal with them?
Yeah, so I would say, a lot of times they try to bite off too much. So as an example, organizations oftentimes have an externally facing application, and that is kind of often the crown jewel of that particular organization, and that oftentimes is the best place to start, because that's where you have developers that are most likely, in the cloud native world. They're deploying, microservices into Kubernetes, and they can actually go adopt the technology. And so I would say the developers and engineering managers, engineering leaders are the ones that are leading the charge to cloud native authorization. I would say that IT is, not yet there. They have an even more painful problem, right? Because they have, like I said, N application and N employees, and they have to manage the cross product of those. But trying to get the entire organization onto a single authorization system is a very daunting thing, because you may have a lot of applications that you have no control over. And so how do you actually get them to sit on top of a single authorization system? Well, that will take time, in the same way that OAuth 2 and SAML drove this, interoperability across all these things so that Okta could go work with more and more and more of these, SaaS, applications. Today, that's true, but when they first started 10 years ago, that wasn't true, right? And so I think there needs to be a little bit of patience in terms of how much of the application estate moves at the same time to a new authorization model. And often starting with the applications that you have control over, so your externally facing application or maybe a set of internal applications that you want to move forward, that's the best place to start. But, the biggest impediment, I would say, is kind of that big bang approach where you want to move everything at the same time. That's going to be a multi-year project. And so just like anything, having a staged, crawl, walk, run type of approach to moving to modern authorization is probably the best approach.
Right, great response. So for someone listening to that and they're more hopeful, could you kind of tease them on a bit more, talking about some of the early results that your customers see when they adopt Aserto and coming from a more traditional model? What are some of the early results that they see? How long does it take to see those results?
Yeah, so as I kind of went through our getting started experience, within 5 minutes you have kind of a front end and a back end running on your computer in your language, talking to an Aserto authorizer. So you get a spark in 5 minutes, or your next one's free, so to speak, and that gives you some idea. So when you start looking at the code, you go, okay, I can see what the application did. And then I get into the documentation and I realize, this is not hard. I can actually go make a REST or a gRPC call using one of Aserto's SDKs, and that makes it easy. We have a hosted authorizer that we stand up for you, so there's nothing to run if you just want to get started with something hosted. If you want to get started with Topz, it's just a Docker pull away. We have a CLI, brew install, Aserto dev /tap / Topz. And you basically have Topz running, and then you configure and start it. So getting started is really easy. I would say, within a week, you have a pretty good idea of how to wire authorization into your application. And within, 2, 3, 4 weeks, you have it incorporated. So we've seen certainly, organizations that have been able to get, within 3 or 4 weeks, they've moved from what they have, they move completely to a new authorization model. So it's not, it's certainly not hard to do. Oftentimes the driver will be, we know that we want to centralize authorization across all of our microservices, or we know that we need fine-grained access control. Today we have coarse-grained roles, we have admin and member and viewer, and that's it. And our customers are starting to ask for finer-grained permissions. Those tend to be drivers. Sometimes organizations that sell to larger companies will say, we need decision logs. Are we really going to build that ourselves? So there's a few different entry points into the decision to revisit authorization. But once you've decided to revisit authorization, then you'll find Aserto to be very easy to work with.
Right. And what would you say is the one big benefit that your customers experience with Aserto? Would you say it's something like better visibility into roles? Would you say it's a lot of time saved? Would you say it's better security? Which of these would you say is the top factor that the top benefit that Aserto customers value?
I would say the 3 things that all come up universally are time to market. So it'll take a much shorter time than to build my own authorization system. TCO, so it's much cheaper to adopt a solution that kind of most of it is off the shelf, and only the last 10 or 20% I have to customize to my needs, than to have to go build everything from scratch on top of an open source project like OPA or even Topz. And then the third thing is security posture. So people feel much more, safer with a product that is built by security experts that think about authorization every day, all day, as opposed to most developer teams, basically, it's not to say that they don't understand security, but it's not their core business. It's an important consideration. And so if you can actually have something that has a lot of these patterns built into it, principle of least privilege, separation of duties, continuous monitoring and continuous authorization, real-time authorization. All these principles are zero trust principles that you'd have to kind of build yourself. But we've essentially created software that embodies all those principles.
Awesome. Really exciting. Last two questions for you. Could you tell us a bit about pricing? How does it work for Aserto?
Yeah, so we basically price per user. So however many users you have in the Aserto directory, we have pricing that is built off of that. We have 3 editions: a starter edition, a pro edition, and an enterprise edition. The enterprise edition is focused on enterprises that have multiple or many applications that they want to kind of basically make work on top of a single authorization control plane. The Pro Edition is aimed at typically SaaS companies that have a product with external users, and they want to have a unified and streamlined and modern authorization system that supports fine-grained, policy-based real-time access control. And then of course we have a free tier, that's free forever, up to 1,000 users. So much like if you think about the Auth0, commercial model, which is per user, that's the one that we've adopted. There are some use cases that are less user-centric, or that require, running more of the Aserto software stack, kind of in your own cloud, in your own VPC. And we're flexible in terms of the pricing model for that, but our, kind of typical pricing model is per user.
Okay, awesome. Great. Last question about Aserto. Is there anything upcoming that you're excited about in terms of features and what's possible? What the roadmap? Get us excited about what's ahead for Aserto.
Yeah, we're very excited about our directory. So we found that more people are interested in running our directory standalone. And so we're starting to look at what it would take to do that. Like, as a reminder, the directory is that, kind of like the place where we store users and groups, and then domain-specific object types like organizations, organizations, teams, projects, lists, documents, folders, all those things, and the relationships between all those things. And so, one of the, kind of approaches that we have is a very, comprehensive integration with the sources of truth for that data, including identity providers for user and group information. And so many people have actually asked us, hey, this directory is super cool, not just for authorization, but I want to be able to ask questions like, for this user, what objects are they connected to? Or for this object, who has read access to this thing? Those are not necessarily authorization scenarios. This is not like, does Twain have read permission on this document? Those are what if type of scenarios. And so we're very excited about making more of that available in the directory.
A lot of context. That's really exciting. So thanks so much, Omri, for just sharing with us just from your wealth of knowledge. I think it was very informative just listening to you just kind of paint the whole picture for us from, the broad strokes down to the fine details of how things work under the hood with Aserto and Topz. It was really just a grand tour of how authorization works today. So thanks so much for all of that, sharing all of that with us today. Before you go, I've got a couple of questions to get to know you a bit, some fun ones, hopefully. So the first one, which I ask all of my guests is, what would be your alternate career path if not for your job in tech?
Wow, that's a good one. I would say that earlier in life, I would have answered, be in music, in the music business. I like music. I play guitar. I would say not super well, but I've been playing it since I was in my teens, and so more recently, I would say maybe ski bum, because when I'm not doing the startup thing, when I'm not startuping, I'm skiing. I love going skiing. So those are the two passions I have besides tech.
Favorite spot so far?
Favorite spot. So Whistler is definitely top 2 for me. Park City. Those are probably the spots that I go to most. And For local skiing, I go to a place called Stevens Pass in Washington. That's about an hour and 20 minutes away from my house. So, if it looks like it's a bluebird day, kind of I can do my morning meetings, throw my skis in the car, drive up, and it's a very nice place to ski the afternoon.
All right. What's one work tool you can't live without?
Wow, I guess early in my career I would have said Emacs. Now it's VS Code and GitHub. I have to confess, even as the CEO, I still try to stay close to the product because it's a product for developers, and if you want to understand your audience, you have to be one. And so those are probably the tools I spend the most time in.
Neat. Next question about just one software or tool or product that you think is built very elegantly.
Again, I'll go back to those tools. I would say Emacs was built super elegantly because it was extensible in Lisp. It was in Lisp, and you could extend it in Lisp. And VS Code is similar in the sense that their plugin architecture is phenomenal, right? I mean, it's become, I would say, the leading source code editor just because it's so easy to kind of bring your own experience to it. Kubernetes is another example of something that was built to be extensible. The CRD architecture in Kubernetes is one where you can actually extend the system. The Crossplane project, shout out to those guys, do a great job at using the Kubernetes extensibility to be able to manage resources of different types that are not in the core Kubernetes system. So anytime there's that kind of architectural decoupling, layer of indirection that allows you to create an ecosystem of things, I think that's a very powerful thing. And I always think that that's very elegant.
Really cool. Wow. And yeah, you're like the second person back to back who's mentioning VS Code as their favorite product. So yeah, really cool. The next question I'm really curious to hear your response about, which is, being a CEO, what kind of CEO do you aspire to be? What is one core value that you have?
I would say the biggest thing I've learned as a person who's been trained as an engineer is it doesn't matter unless a customer is using it. And so I want to be bringing customer orientation to the team every day, and live the life of a customer, like bring that empathy as much as possible back to the team, because in the end that's what we're doing it for, right? It's fun to build technology, but if you're not building it for somebody to solve a burning problem that they have, then you're not maximizing I think the point of building something new, right? And so that's what I try to do as much as I can, is bring that customer empathy and the customer orientation to the team.
Really cool. Great. Your last question, Omri, is your favorite source to find out what's new and happening in tech. Where do you go?
I don't know that it's one particular place, but I would say the common denominator is just talk to people. So whether it's in particular groups, whether it's on Discord or whether it's in Slacks or whether it's at conferences. KubeCon is happening, right around the corner here. Going to conference is great because you get to learn about new things and you get to hear about what people are talking about. So, I would say that those are just, kind of learning what people are excited about. Oftentimes, face-to-face is the best, but, just even being in kind of like the next best thing, which is, Slack channels or Discord channels.
Yeah, I can totally vouch for that with the podcast and stuff. There's so much to learn from different people that I talked to, including you today. There's just, it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. There was lots that I learned, and I'm sure our listeners as well got to learn a lot about authorization, authentication, difference, and how it works. And so everyone who's listening, if you're excited about this, go and check out Aserto, check out Topz, the open source project. Some really cool things that Omri told us about them today. So with that, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you all for joining us. And thanks once again, Omri, for joining us and sharing generously from all of the insights that you shared today. Thank you.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Tony.
All right. Till next time. Bye-bye.